incompatible with the tobacco business and father and mother's feelings. I mistaken on a point that, even at the present moment, makes me take out my pocket handkerchief like a great girl, as people say, though I am sure I don't know why a great girl should be a term of reproach, for every rightly constituted male mind loves 'em great and small. Don't tell me so, don't tell me so. Still, highly respectable at bottom, though absurd enough upon the surface, young John took out his pocket handkerchief with a genuine absence both of display and concealment, which is only to be seen in a man with a great deal of good in him, when he takes out his pocket handkerchief for the purpose of wiping his eyes. Having dried them, and indulged in the harmless luxury of a sob and a sniff, he put it up again. The touch was still in its influence so like a blow that Arthur could not get many words together to close the subject with. He assured John Chivery, when he had returned his handkerchief to his pocket, that he did all honour to his disinterestedness and to the fidelity of his remembrance of Miss Dorrit. As to the impression on his mind of which he had just relieved it, here John interposed and said, "No impression, certainty. As to that, they might perhaps speak of it at another time, but would say no more now." Feeling low-spirited and weary, he would go back to his room with John's leave, and come out no more that night. John assented, and he crept back in the shadow of the wall to his own lodging. The feeling of the blow was still so strong upon him that, when the dirty old woman was gone, whom he found sitting on the stairs outside his door, waiting to make his bed, and who gave him to understand while doing it that she had received her instructions from Mr. Chivery, not the old un but the young un, he sat down in the faded armchair, pressing his head between his hands, as if he had been stunned. Little Dorrit love him? More bewildering to him than his misery, far. Consider the improbability. He had been accustomed to call her his child and his dear child, and to invite her confidence by dwelling upon the difference in their respective ages, and to speak of himself as one who was turning old. Yet she might not have thought him old. Something reminded him that he had not thought himself so until the roses had floated away upon the river. He had 2 letters among other papers in his box, and he took them out and read them. There seemed to be a sound in them like the sound of her sweet voice. It fell upon his ear with many tones of tenderness that were not insusceptible of the new meaning. Now it was that the quiet desolation of her answer, "No, no, no," made to him that night in that very room, that night when he had been shown the dawn of her altered fortune, and when other words had passed between them which he had been destined to remember in humiliation and a prisoner, rushed into his mind. Consider the improbability. But it had a preponderating tendency, when considered, to become fainter. There was another and a curious inquiry of his own heart's that concurrently became stronger. In the reluctance he had felt to believe that she loved anyone, in his desire to set that question at rest, in a half-formed consciousness he had had that there would be a kind of nobleness in his helping her love for anyone, were there no suppressed feeling on his own side that he had hushed it as it arose? Had he ever whispered to himself that he must not think of such a thing as her loving him, that he must not take advantage of her gratitude, that he must keep his experience in remembrance as a warning and reproof, that he must regard such youthful hopes as having passed away, as his friend's dead daughter had passed away, that he must surely be steady in saying to himself that the time had gone by him, and he was too saddened and old? He had kissed her when he raised her from the ground on the day when she had been so consistently and expressively forgotten, quite as he might have kissed her if she had been conscious. No difference. The darkness found him occupied with these thoughts. The darkness also found Mr. and Mrs. Plornish knocking at his door. They brought with them a basket filled with choice selections from that stock in trade which met with such a quick sale and produced such a slow return. Mrs. Plornish was affected to tears. Mr. Plornish amiably growled in his philosophical but not lucid manner that there was ups, you see, and there was downs. It was in vain to ask why ups, why downs. There they was, you know. He had heard it given for a truth that according as the world went round, which round it did revolve, undoubted, even the best of gentlemen must take his turn of standing with his head upside down and all his air of flying the wrong way into what you might call space. Very well, then. What Mr. Plornish said was, very well, then. That gentleman's head would come upwards when his turn come. That gentleman's hair would be a pleasure to look upon, being all smooth again, and very well, then. It has been already stated that Mrs. Plornish, not being philosophical, wept. It further happened that Mrs. Plornish, not being philosophical, was intelligible. It may have arisen out of her softened state of mind, out of her sex's wit, out of a woman's quick association of ideas, or out of a woman's no association of ideas, but it further happened somehow that Mrs. Plornish's intelligibility displayed itself upon the very subject of Arthur's meditations. "The way father has been talking about you, Mr. Clennam," said Mrs. Plornish, "you hardly would believe. It made him quite poorly. As to his voice, this misfortune has took it away. You know what a sweet singer father is, but he couldn't get a note out of it for the children at tea, if you'll credit what I tell you." While speaking, Mrs. Plornish shook her head and wiped her eyes and looked retrospectively about the room. "As to Mr. Baptiste," pursued Mrs. Plornish, "whatever he'll do when he comes to know of it, I can't conceive nor yet imagine. He'd have been here before now, you may be sure, but that he's away on confidential business of your own. The persevering manner in which he follows up that business and gives himself no rest from it, he really do," said Mrs. Plornish, winding up in the Italian manner. "As I say to him, musatonisha padrone." Though not conceited, Mrs. Plornish felt that she had turned this Tuscan sentence with peculiar elegance. Mr. Plornish could not conceal his exultation in her accomplishments as a linguist. "But what I say is, Mr. Clennam," the good woman went on, "there's always something to be thankful for as I am sure you will yourself admit. Speaking in this room, it's not hard to think what the present something is. It's a thing to be thankful for, indeed, that Miss Dorrit is not here to know it." Arthur thought she looked at him with particular expression. "It's a thing," reiterated Mrs. Plornish, "to be thankful for, indeed, that Miss Dorrit is far away. It's to be hoped that she is not likely to hear of it. If she had not been here to see it, sir, it's not to be doubted that the sight of you," Mrs. Plornish repeated those words, "not to be doubted that the sight of you, in misfortune and trouble, would have been almost too much for her affectionate heart. There's nothing that I can think of that would have touched Miss Dorrit so bad as that." Of a certainty Mrs. Plornish did look at him now with a sort of quivering defiance in her friendly emotion. "Yes," said she, "and it shows what notice father takes, though at his time of life that he says to me this afternoon, which happy cottage knows I neither make it up nor anyways enlarge, 'Mary, it's much to be rejoiced in that Miss Dorrit is not on the spot to behold it.' Those were father's words. Father's own words was, 'Much to be rejoiced in, Mary, that Miss Dorrit is not on the spot to behold it.' I says to father then, I says to him, 'Father, you were right, that,'" Mrs. Plornish concluded with the air of a very precise legal witness, "is what passed betwixt father and me, and I tell you nothing but what did pass betwixt father and me." Mr. Plornish, as being of a more laconic temperament, embraced this opportunity of interposing with the suggestion that she should now leave Mr. Clennam to himself. "For you see," said Mr. Plornish gravely, "I know what it is, old gal," repeating that valuable remark several times, as if it appeared to him to include some great moral secret. Finally, the worthy couple went away arm in arm. Little Dorrit, again for hours, always little Dorrit. Happily, if it ever had been so, it was over, and better over. Granted that she had loved him, and he had known it, and had suffered himself to love her. What a road to have led her away upon, the road that would have brought her back to this miserable place. He ought to be much comforted by the reflection that she was quit of it for ever, that she was, or would soon be, married. Vague rumours of her father's projects in that direction had reached Bleeding Heart Yard with the news of his sister's marriage, and that the Marshalsea gate had shut for ever on all those perplexed possibilities of a time that was gone. Dear little Dorrit! Looking back upon his own poor story, she was its vanishing point. Everything in its perspective led to her innocent figure. He had travelled thousands of miles towards it. Previous unquiet hopes and doubts had worked themselves out before it. It was the centre of the interest of his life. It was the termination of everything that was good and pleasant in it. Beyond, there was nothing but mere waste and darkened sky. As ill at ease on the first night of his lying down to sleep within those dreary walls, he wore the night out with such thoughts. What time young John lay wrapped in peaceful slumber, after composing and arranging the following monumental inscription on his pillow: "Stranger, respect the tomb of John Chivery, Jr., who died at an advanced age not necessary to mention. He encountered his rival in a distressed state, and felt inclined to have a round with him, but, for the sake of the loved one, conquered those feelings of bitterness, and became magnanimous." Chapter 28. An appearance in the Marshalsea. The opinion of the community outside the prison gates bore hard on Clennam as time went on, and he made no friends among the community within. Too depressed to associate with the herd in the yard, who got together to forget their cares, too retiring and too unhappy to join in the poor socialities of the tavern, he kept his own room and was held in distrust. Some said he was proud, some objected that he was sullen and reserved, some were contemptuous of him, for that he was a poor-spirited dog who pined under his debts. The whole population was shy of him on these various counts of indictment, but especially the last, which involved a species of domestic treason, and he soon became so confirmed in his seclusion that his only time for walking up and down was when the evening club were assembled at their songs and toasts and sentiments, and when the yard was nearly left to the women and children. Imprisonment began to tell upon him. He knew that he idled and moped. After what he had known of the influences of imprisonment within the four small walls of the very room he occupied, this consciousness made him afraid of himself. Shrinking from the observation of other men, and shrinking from his own, he began to change very sensibly. Anybody might see that the shadow of the wall was dark upon him. One day, when he might have been some 10 or 12 weeks in jail, and when he had been trying to read and had not been able to release even the imaginary people of the book from the Marshalsea, a footstep stopped at his door, and a hand tapped at it. He arose and opened it, and an agreeable voice accosted him with, "How do you do, Mr. Clennam? I hope I am not unwelcome in calling to see you." It was the sprightly young barnacle, Ferdinand. He looked very good-natured and prepossessing, though overpoweringly gay and free in contrast with the squalid prison. "You are surprised to see me, Mr. Clennam?" he said, taking the seat which Clennam offered him. "I must confess to being much surprised." "Not disagreeably, I hope?" "By no means." "Thank you. Frankly," said the engaging young barnacle, "I have been excessively sorry to hear that you were under the necessity of a temporary retirement here, and I hope, of course, as between two private gentlemen, that our place has had nothing to do with it." "Your office?" "Our circumlocution place. I cannot charge any part of my reverses upon that remarkable establishment." "'Pon my life," said the vivacious young barnacle, "I am heartily glad to know it. It is quite a relief to me to hear you say it. I should have so exceedingly regretted our place having had anything to do with your difficulties." Clennam again assured him that he absolved it of the responsibility. "That's right," said Ferdinand. "I am very happy to hear it. I was rather afraid in my own mind that we might have helped to floor you, because there is no doubt that it is our misfortune to do that kind of thing now and then. We don't want to do it, but if men will be gravelled, why, we can't help it." "Without giving an unqualified assent to what you say," returned Arthur gloomily, "I am much obliged to you for your interest in me." "No, but really, our place is," said the easy young barnacle, The most inoffensive place possible. You'll say we are a humbug. I won't say we are not. But all that sort of thing is intended to be and must be. Don't you see?" "I do not," said Clennam. "You don't regard it from the right point of view. It is the point of view that is the essential thing. Regard our place from the point of view that we only ask you to leave us alone, and we are as capital as a department as you'll find anywhere." "Is your place there to be left alone?" asked Clennam. "You exactly hit it," returned Ferdinand. "It is there with the express intention that everything shall be left alone. That is what it means. That is what it's for. No doubt there's a certain form to be kept up, that it's for something else, but it's only a form. Why, good heaven, we are nothing but forms. Think what a lot of our forms you have gone through. And have you never got any nearer to an end?" "Never," said Clennam. "Look at it from the right point of view, and there you have us, official and effectual. It's like a limited game of cricket. A field of outsiders are always going into bowl at the public service, and we block the balls." Clennam asked what became of the bowlers. The airy young Barnacle replied that they grew tired, got dead-beat, got lamed, got their backs broken, died off, gave it up, went in for other games. "And this occasions me to congratulate myself again," he pursued, "on the circumstances that our place has had nothing to do with your temporary retirement. It very easily might have had a hand in it, because it's undeniable that we are sometimes a most unlucky place in our efforts upon people who will not leave us alone. Mr. Clennam, I am quite unreserved with you. As between yourself and myself, I know I may be. I was so when I first saw you making the mistake of not leaving us alone, because I perceived that you were inexperienced and sanguine, and had, I hope you'll not object to my saying, some simplicity." "Not at all." "Some simplicity. Therefore, I felt what a pity it was, and I went out of my way to hint to you, which really was not official, but I never am official when I can help it, something to the effect that if I were you, I wouldn't bother myself. However, you did bother yourself, and you have since bothered yourself. Now, don't do it any more." "I am not likely to have the opportunity," said Clennam. "Oh, yes, you are. You'll leave here. Everybody leaves here. There are no ends of ways of leaving here. Now, don't come back to us. That entreaty is the second object of my call. Pray, don't come back to us, upon my honour," said Ferdinand in a very friendly and confiding way. "I shall be greatly vexed if you don't take warning by the past and keep away from us." "And the invention?" said Clennam. "My good fellow," returned Ferdinand, "if you'll excuse the freedom of that form of address, nobody wants to know of the invention, and nobody cares twopence halfpenny about it." "Nobody in the office, that is to say?" "Nor out of it. Everybody is ready to dislike and ridicule any invention. You have no idea how many people want to be left alone. You have no idea how the genius of the country, overlook the parliamentary nature of the phrase and don't be bored by it, tends to being left alone. Believe me, Mr. Clennam," said the sprightly young Barnacle in his pleasantest manner, "our place is not a wicked giant to be charged at full tilt, but only a windmill showing you, as it grinds immense quantities of chaff, which way the country wind blows." "If I could believe that," said Clennam, "it would be a dismal prospect for all of us." "Oh, don't say so," returned Ferdinand. "It's all right. We must have humbug. We all like humbug. We couldn't get on without humbug. A little humbug and a groove, and everything goes on admirably if you leave it alone." With this hopeful confession of his faith as the head of the rising Barnacles who were born of woman, to be followed under a variety of watchwords which they utterly repudiated and disbelieved, Ferdinand rose. Nothing could be more agreeable than his frank and courteous bearing, or adapted with a more gentlemanly instinct to the circumstances of his visit. "Is it fair to ask," he said, as Clennam gave him his hand with a real feeling of thankfulness for his candour and good humour, "whether it is true that our late lamented Merdle is the cause of this passing inconvenience?" "I am one of the many he has ruined, yes." "He must have been an exceedingly clever fellow," said Ferdinand Barnacle. Arthur, not being in the mood to extol the memory of the deceased, was silent. "A consummate rascal, of course," said Ferdinand, "but remarkably clever. One cannot help admiring the fellow. Must have been such a master of humbug. Knew people so well, got over them so completely, did so much with them. In his easy way, he was really moved to genuine admiration. I hope so, said Arthur, that he and his dupes may be a warning to people not to have so much done with them again. My dear Mr. Clennam, returned Ferdinand, laughing, have you really such a verdant hope? The next man who has as large a capacity and has a genuine taste for swindling will succeed as well. Pardon me, but I think you really have no idea how the human bees will swarm to the beating of any old tin kettle. In that fact lies the complete manual of governing them. Why, they can be got to believe that the kettle is made of the precious metals. In that fact lies the whole power of men like our late lamented. No doubt there are, here and there, said Ferdinand politely, exceptional cases where people have been taken in for what appeared to them to be much better reasons, and I need not go far to find such a case, but they don't invalidate the rule. Good day. I hope that when I have the pleasure of seeing you next, this passing cloud will have given place to sunshine. Don't come a step beyond the door. I know the way out perfectly. Good day. With those words, the best and brightest of the Barnacles went downstairs, hummed his way through the lodge, mounted his horse in the front courtyard, and rode off to keep an appointment with his noble kinsman, who wanted a little coaching before he could triumphantly answer certain infidel snobs who were going to question the nobs about their statesmanship. He must have passed Mr. Rugg on his way out, for a minute or two afterwards that ruddy-headed gentleman shone in at the door like an elderly Phoebus. "How do you do today, sir?" said Mr. Rugg. "Is there any little thing I can do for you today, sir?" "No, I thank you." Mr. Rugg's enjoyment of embarrassed affairs was like a housekeeper's enjoyment in pickling and preserving, or a washerwoman's enjoyment of a heavy wash, or a dustman's enjoyment of an overflowing dustbin, or any other professional enjoyment of a mess in the way of business. "I still look round from time to time, sir," said Mr. Rugg cheerfully, "to see whether any lingering detainers are accumulating at the gate. They have fallen in pretty thick, sir, as thick as we could have expected." He remarked upon the circumstance as if it were a matter of congratulation, rubbing his hands briskly and rolling his head a little. "As thick," repeated Mr. Rugg, "as we could have reasonably expected. Quite a shower bath of 'em. I don't often intrude upon you now, when I look round, because I know you are not inclined for company, and that if you wished to see me you would leave word in the lodge. But I am here pretty well every day, sir. Would this be an unreasonable time, sir?" asked Mr. Rugg coaxingly, "for me to offer an observation?" "As seasonable time as any other." Public opinion, sir," said Mr. Rugg, "has been busy with you." "I don't doubt it." "Might it not be advisable, sir," said Mr. Rugg, more coaxingly yet, "now to make at last, and after all, a trifling concession to public opinion? We all do it in one way or another. The fact is, we must do it." "I cannot set myself right with him, Mr. Rugg, and have no business to expect that I ever shall." "Don't say that, sir, don't say that. The cost of being moved to the bench is almost insignificant, and if the general feeling is strong that you ought to be there, why, really—" "I thought you had settled, Mr. Rugg," said Arthur, "that my determination to remain here was a matter of taste." "Well, sir, well, but is it good taste? Is it good taste? That's the question." Mr. Rugg was so soothingly persuasive as to be quite pathetic. "I was almost going to say, is it good feeling? This is an extensive affair of yours, and your remaining here where a man can come for £1 or two is remarked upon as not in keeping. It is not in keeping. I can't tell you, sir, in how many quarters I heard it mentioned. I heard comments made upon it last night in a parlour frequented by what I should call, if I did not look in there now and then myself, the best legal company. I heard their comments on it that I was sorry to hear. They hurt me on your account. Again, only this morning at breakfast, my daughter, but a woman you'll say, yet still with a feeling for these things, and even with some little personal experience as the plaintiff in Rugg and Borkins, was expressing her great surprise, her great surprise. Now, under these circumstances, and considering that none of us can quite set ourselves above public opinion, wouldn't a trifling concession to that opinion be— Come, sir, said Rugg, I will put it on the lowest ground of argument, and say, amiable? Arthur's thoughts had once more wandered away to Little Dorrit, and the question remained unanswered. As to myself, sir, said Mr. Rugg, hoping that his eloquence had reduced him to a state of indecision, it is a principle of mine not to consider myself when a client's inclinations are in the scale, but knowing your considerate character and general wish to oblige, I will repeat that I should prefer your being in the bench. Your case has made a noise. It is a creditable case to be professionally concerned in. I should feel on a better standing with my connection if you went to the bench. Don't let that influence you, sir. I merely state the fact. So errant had the prisoner's attention already grown in solitude and dejection, and so accustomed had it become to commune with only one silent figure within the ever-frowning walls, that Clennam had to shake off a kind of stupor before he could look at Mr. Rugg, recall the thread of his talk, and hurriedly say, I am unchanged, and unchangeable in my decision. Pray, let it be, let it be. Mr. Rugg, without concealing that he was nettled and mortified, replied, Oh, beyond a doubt, sir. I have travelled out of the record, sir, I am aware, in putting the point to you. But really, when I heard it remarked in several companies, and in very good company, that however worthy of a foreigner, it is not worthy of the spirit of an Englishman to remain in the Marshalsea, when the glorious liberties of his island home admit of his removal to the bench, I thought I would depart from the narrow professional line marked out to me, and mention it. Personally, said Mr. Rugg, I have no opinion on the topic. That's well, returned Arthur. Oh, none at all, sir, said Mr. Rugg. If I had, I should have been unwilling some minutes ago to see a client of mine visited in this place by a gentleman of a high-quality family riding a saddle-horse. But it was not my business. If I had, I might have wished to be now empowered to mention to another gentleman, a gentleman of military exterior at present waiting in the lodge, that my client had never intended to remain here and was on the eve of removal to a superior abode. But my course as a professional machine is clear. I have nothing to do with it. Is it your good pleasure to see the gentleman, sir? Who is waiting to see me, did you say? I did take that unprofessional liberty, sir. Hearing that I was your professional adviser, he declined to interpose before my very limited function was performed. Happily, said Mr. Rugg, with sarcasm, I did not so far travel out of the record as to ask the gentleman for his name. I suppose I have no resource but to see him, sighed Clennam wearily. Then it is your good pleasure, sir, retorted Rugg. Am I honoured by your instructions to mention as much to the gentleman as I pass out? I am, thank you, sir. I take my leave. His leave he took, accordingly, in dudgeon. The gentleman of military exterior had so imperfectly awakened Clennam's curiosity, in the existing state of his mind, that a half-forgetfulness of such a visitor's having been referred to was already creeping over it as a part of the sombre veil which almost always dimmed it now, when a heavy footstep on the stairs aroused him. It appeared to ascend them not very promptly or spontaneously, yet with a display of stride and clatter meant to be insulting. As it paused for a moment on the landing outside his door, he could not recall his association with the peculiarity of its sound, though he thought he had one. Only a moment was given him for consideration. His door was immediately swung open by a thump, and in the doorway stood the missing Blondois, the cause of many anxieties. "Salve, fellow jailbird," said he. "You want me, it seems. Here I am." Before Arthur could speak to him in his indignant wonder, Cavaletto followed him into the room. Mr. Panks followed Cavaletto. Neither of the two had been there since its present occupant had had possession of it. Mr. Panks, breathing hard, sidled near the window, put his hat on the ground, stirred his hair up with both hands, and folded his arms like a man who had come to a pause in a hard day's work. Mr. Baptiste, never taking his eyes from his dreaded chum of old, softly sat down on the floor with his back against the door and one of his ankles in each hand. Resuming the attitude, except that it was now expressive of unwinking watchfulness, in which he had sat before the same man in the deeper shade of another prison one hot morning at Marseilles. "I have it on the witnessing of these two madmen," said Monsieur Blondois, otherwise Lanier, otherwise Rigaud, "that you want me, Brother Bird. Here I am." Glancing round contemptuously at the bedstead, which was turned up by day, he leaned his back against it as a resting-place without removing his hat from his head, and stood defiantly lounging with his hands in his pockets. "You villain of ill omen," said Arthur, "you have purposely cast a dreadful suspicion upon my mother's house. Why have you done it? What prompted you to the devilish invention?" Monsieur Rigaud, after frowning at him for a moment, laughed. "Here, this noble gentleman. Listen, all the world to this creature of virtue. But take care, take care. It is possible, my friend, that your ardour is a little compromising. Holy blue, it is possible." "Signore," interposed Cavaletto, also addressing Arthur, "for to commence, hear me. I received your instructions to find him, Rigaud, is it not?" "It is the truth." "I go, consequentemente." It would have given Mrs. Plornish great concern if she could have been persuaded that his occasional lengthening of an adverb in this way was the chief fault of his English. "First among my countrymen, I ask them what news in Londres of foreigners arrived. Then I go among the French. Then I go among the Germans. They all tell me. The great part of us know as well the other, and they all tell me. But no person can tell me nothing of him, Rigaud. 15 times, said Cavaletto, thrice throwing out his left hand with all his fingers spread, and doing it so rapidly that the sense of sight could hardly follow the action. I ask him in every place where go the foreigners, and 15 times, repeating the same swift performance, they know nothing. But, at this significant Italian rest on the word, but, his backhanded shake of his right forefinger came into play, a very little and very cautiously, but after a long time, when I have not been able to find that he is here in Londres, someone tells me of a soldier with a white hair, eh? Not hair like this that he carries white, who lives retired secrementally in a certain place, but, with another rest upon the word, who sometimes in the after-dinner walks and smokes. It is necessary, as they say in Italy, and as they know poor people, to have patience. I have a patience. I ask, where is this certain place? One believes it is here, one believes it is there. Eh, well, it is not here, it is not there. I wait patientissimally. At last I find it. Then I watch, then I hide, until he walks and smokes. He is a soldier with grey hair, but a very decided rest indeed, and a very vigorous play from side to side of the back-handed forefinger. He is also this man that you see. It was noticeable that, in his old habit of submission to one who had been at the trouble of asserting superiority over him, he even then bestowed upon Rigaud a confused bend of his head after thus pointing him out. "Eh, well, signore," he cried in conclusion, addressing Arthur again, "I awaited for a good opportunity. I writed some words to Signor Panco," an air of novelty came over Mr. Panks with this designation, "to come and help. I showed him, Rigaud, it is a window to Signor Panco, who was often the spy in the day. I slept at night near the door of the house. At last we entered, only this today, and now you see him, as he would not come up in presence of the illustrious advocate." Such was Mr. Baptiste's honourable mention of Mr. Rugg. We waited down below there together, and Signor Panco guarded the street. At the close of this recital, Arthur turned his eyes upon the impudent and wicked face. As it met his, the nose came down over the moustache, and the moustache went up under the nose. When nose and moustache had settled into their places again, Monsieur Rigaud loudly snapped his fingers 6 times, bending forward to jerk the snaps at Arthur, as if they were palpable missiles which he jerked into his face. "Now, philosopher," said Rigaud, "what do you want with me?" "I want to know," returned Arthur, without disguising his abhorrence, How you dare direct a suspicion of murder against my mother's house?" "Dare?" cried Rigaud. "Oh, hear him dare! Is it dare, by heaven, my small boy? But you are a little imprudent." "I want that suspicion to be cleared away," said Arthur. "You shall be taken there and be publicly seen. I want to know, moreover, what business you had there when I had a burning desire to fling you downstairs. Don't frown at me, man. I have seen enough of you to know that you are a bully and a coward. I need no revival of my spirits from the effects of this wretched place to tell you so plain a fact, and one that you know so well." White to the lips, Rigaud stroked his moustache, muttering, "By heaven, my small boy, you are a little compromising of my lady, your respectable mother," and seemed for a minute undecided how to act. His indecision was soon gone. He sat himself down with a threatening swagger and said, "Give me a bottle of wine. You can buy wine here. Send one of your madmen to get me a bottle of wine. I won't talk to you without wine. Come, yes or no?" "Fetch him what he wants, Cavaletto," said Arthur, scornfully, producing the money. "Contraband beast," added Rigaud. "Bring port wine. I'll drink nothing but Porto. The contraband beast, however, assuring all present with his significant finger, peremptorily declined to leave his post at the door. Signor Panco offered his services. He soon returned with a bottle of wine which, according to the custom of the place, originating in a scarcity of corkscrews among the collegians in common with a scarcity of much else, was already opened for use. "Madman, a large glass," said Rigaud. Signor Panco put a tumbler before him, not without a visible conflict of feeling on the question of throwing it at his head. Boasted Rigaud. "Once a gentleman and always a gentleman. A gentleman from the beginning and a gentleman to the end. What the devil! A gentleman must be waited on, I hope. It's part of my character to be waited on." He half filled the tumbler as he said it, and drank off the contents when he had done saying it. "Ah," smacking his lips, "not a very old prisoner, that. I judge by your looks, brave sir, that imprisonment will subdue your blood much sooner than it softens this hot wine. You are mellowing, losing body and colour already. I salute you." He tossed off another half-glass, holding it up both before and afterwards so as to display his small white hand. "To business," he then continued, "to conversation. You have shown yourself more free of speech than body, sir. I have used the freedom of telling you what you know yourself to be. You know yourself, as we all know you, to be far worse than that. Add, always a gentleman, and it's no matter. Except in that regard, we are all alike. For example, you couldn't for your life be a gentleman. I couldn't for my life be otherwise. How great the difference! Let us go on. Words, sir, never influence the course of the cards or the course of the dice. Do you know that? You do. I also play a game, and words are without power over it." Now that he was confronted with Cavaletto and knew that his story was known, whatever thin disguise he had worn he dropped and faced it out with a bare face as the infamous wretch he was. "Now, my son," he resumed, with a snap of his fingers, "I play my game to the end in spite of words, and death of my body and death of my soul, I'll win it. You want to know why I played this little trick that you have interrupted? Know, then, that I had, and that I have, do you understand me, have a commodity to sell to my lady, your respectable mother. I described my precious commodity and fixed my price. Touching the bargain, your admirable mother was a little too calm, too stolid, too immovable and statue-like. In fine, your admirable mother vexed me. To make variety in my position and to amuse myself, what a gentleman must be amused at somebody's expense, I conceived the happy idea of disappearing, an idea, see you, that your characteristic mother and my Flintwich would have been well enough pleased to execute. Ah, bah, don't look as from high to low at me, I repeat it. Well enough pleased, excessively enchanted, and with all their hearts ravished. How strongly will you have it?" He threw out the lees of his glass on the ground, so that they nearly spattered Cavaletto. This seemed to draw his attention to him anew. He set down his glass and said, I'll not fill it. What? I am bored to be served. Come then, you, Cavaletto, and fill. The little man looked at Clennam, whose eyes were occupied with Rigaud, and, seeing no prohibition, got up from the ground and poured out from the bottle into the glass. The blending, as he did so, of his old submission with a sense of something humorous, the striving of that with a certain smouldering ferocity, which might have flashed fire in an instant, as the born gentleman seemed to think, for he had a wary eye upon him, and the easy yielding of all to a good-natured, careless, predominant propensity to sit down on the ground again, formed a very remarkable combination of character. "This happy idea, brave sir," Rigaud resumed after drinking, "was a happy idea for several reasons. It amused me. It worried your dear mamma and my Flintwich. It caused you agonies, my terms for a lesson in politeness towards a gentleman, and it suggested to all the amiable persons interested that your entirely devoted is a man to fear. By heaven, he is a man to fear. Beyond this, it might have restored her wit to my lady your mother, might, under the pressing little suspicion your wisdom has recognized, have persuaded her at last to announce covertly in the journals that the difficulties of a certain contract would be removed by the appearance of a certain important party to it. Perhaps yes, perhaps no. But that you have interrupted. Now, what is it you say? What is it you want?" Never had Clennam felt more acutely that he was a prisoner in bonds than when he saw this man before him and could not accompany him to his mother's house. All the undiscernible difficulties and dangers he had ever feared were closing in when he could not stir hand or foot. "Perhaps, my friend, philosopher, man of virtue, imbecile, what you will, perhaps," said Rigaud, pausing in his drink to look out of his glass with his horrible smile, "you would have done better to leave me alone?" "No. At least," said Clennam, "you are known to be alive and unharmed. At least you cannot escape from these two witnesses, and they can produce you before any public authorities or before hundreds of people." "But will not produce me before one," said Rigaud, snapping his fingers again with an air of triumphant menace. "To the devil with your witnesses, to the devil with your produced, to the devil with yourself. What, do I know what I know for that? Have I my commodity on sale for that? Bah, poor debtor! You have interrupted my little project. Let it pass. How then? What remains? To you nothing, to me all. Produce me. Is that what you want? I will produce myself, only too quickly. Contrabandist. Give me pen, ink, and paper." Cavaletto got up again as before, and laid them before him in his former manner. Rigaud, after some villainous thinking and smiling, wrote and read aloud as follows: "To Mrs. Clennam, wait answer. Prison of the Marshalsea, at the apartment of your son. Dear Madam, I am in despair to be informed today by our prisoner here, who has had the goodness to employ spies to seek me living for politic reasons in retirement, that you have had fears for my safety. Reassure yourself, dear madam, I am well, I am strong and constant. With the greatest impatience I should fly to your house, but that I foresee it to be possible under the circumstances that you will not yet have quite definitely arranged the little proposition I have had the honour to submit to you. I name 1 week from this day for a last final visit on my part, when you will unconditionally accept it or reject it, with its train of consequences. I suppress my ardour to embrace you and achieve this interesting business, in order that you may have leisure to adjust its details to our perfect mutual satisfaction. In the meanwhile, it is not too much to propose, our prisoner having deranged my housekeeping, that my expenses of lodging and nourishment at an hotel shall be paid by you. Receive, dear madam, the assurance of my highest and most distinguished consideration, Rigaud Blondois. 1,000 friendships to that dear Flintwich. I kiss the hands of Madame F." When he had finished this epistle, Rigaud folded it and tossed it with a flourish at Clennam's feet. "Hola, you! Apropos of producing, let somebody produce that at its address, and produce the answer here." "Cavaletto," said Arthur, Will you take this fellow's letter?" But Cavaletto's significant finger again expressing that his post was at the door to keep watch over Rigo, now he had found him with so much trouble, and that the duty of his post was to sit on the floor backed up by the door, looking at Rigo and holding his own ankles, Signor Panco once more volunteered. His services being accepted, Cavaletto suffered the door to open barely wide enough to admit his squeezing himself out, and immediately shut it on him. "Touch me with a finger, touch me with an epithet, question my superiority as I sit here drinking my wine at my pleasure," said Rigo, "and I follow the letter and cancel my week's grace. You wanted me? You have got me. How do you like me?" "You know," returned Clennam, with a bitter sense of his helplessness, "that when I sought you, I was not a prisoner." "To the devil with you and your prison," retorted Rigo leisurely, as he took from his pocket a case containing the materials for making cigarettes, and employed his facile hands in folding a few for present use. "I care for neither of you. Contrabandist, a light." Again Cavaletto got up and gave him what he wanted. There had been something dreadful in the noiseless skill of his cold, white hands, with the fingers lithely twisting about and twining one over another like serpents. Clennam could not prevent himself from shuddering inwardly, as if he had been looking on at a nest of those creatures. "Hola, pig!" cried Rigo, with a noisy, stimulating cry as if Cavaletto were an Italian horse or mule. "What? The infernal old jail was a respectable one to this. There was dignity in the bars and stones of that place. It was a prison for men, but this, bah, a hospital for imbeciles." He smoked his cigarette out, with his ugly smile so fixed upon his face that he looked as though he were smoking with his drooping beak of a nose rather than with his mouth, like a fancy in a weird picture. When he had lighted a second cigarette at the still-burning end of the first, he said to Clennam, "One must pass the time in the madman's absence. One must talk. One can't drink strong wine all day long, or I would have another bottle. She's handsome, sir, though not exactly to my taste. Still, by the thunder and the lightning, handsome. I facilitate you on your admiration." "I neither know nor ask," said Clennam, "of whom you speak." "Della bella Gowana, sir, as they say in Italy, of the Gowan, the fair Gowan." "Of whose husband you were the follower, I think." "Sir, follower, you are insolent. The friend." "Do you sell all your friends?" Rigaud took his cigarette from his mouth and eyed him with a momentary revelation of surprise, but he put it between his lips again as he answered with coolness, "I sell anything that commands a price. How do your lawyers live, your politicians, your intriguers, your men of the exchange? How do you live? How do you come here? Have you sold no friend? Lady of mine, I rather think yes." Clennam turned away from him towards the window and sat looking out at the wall. "Effectively, sir," said Rigaud, "society sells itself and sells me, and I sell society. I perceive you have acquaintances with another lady, also handsome, a strong spirit. Let us see, how do they call her? Wade?" He received no answer, but could easily discern that he had hit the mark. "Yes," he went on, "that handsome lady and strong spirit addresses me in the street, and I am not insensible. I respond. That handsome lady and strong spirit does me the favour to remark in full confidence, I have my curiosity, and I have my chagrins. You are not more than ordinarily honourable, perhaps. I announce myself. Madame, a gentleman from the birth and a gentleman to the death, but not more than ordinarily honourable. I despise such a weak fantasy." Thereupon she is pleased to compliment. "The difference between you and the rest is," she answers, "that you say so. For she knows society. I accept her congratulations with gallantry and politeness. Politeness and little gallantries are inseparable from my character. She then makes a proposition which is, in effect, that she has seen us much together, that it appears to her that I am for the passing time the cat of the house, the friend of the family, that her curiosity and her chagrins awaken the fancy to be acquainted with their movements, to know the manner of their life, how the fair goanna is beloved, how the fair goanna is cherished, and so on. She is not rich, but offers such and such little recompenses for the little cares and arrangements of such services, and I graciously, to do everything graciously is part of my character, consent to accept them. Oh, yes, so goes the world. It is the mode." Though Clennam's back was turned while he spoke, and thenceforth to the end of the interview he kept those glittering eyes of his that were too near together upon him, and evidently saw in the very carriage of the head, as he passed with his braggart recklessness from clause to clause of what he said, that he was saying nothing which Clennam did not already know. "Woof, the fair goanna," he said, lighting a third cigarette with a sound as if his lightest breath could blow her away. "Charming, but imprudent, for it was not well of the fair goanna to make mysteries of letters from old lovers, in her bedchamber on the mountain, that her husband might not see them. No, no, that was not well. Woof, the goanna was mistaken there." "I honestly hope," cried Arthur aloud, "that Panks may not be long gone, for this man's presence pollutes the room." "Ah, but he'll flourish here and everywhere," said Rigaud, with an exulting look and a snap of his fingers. "He always has, he always will." Stretching his body out on the only 3 chairs in the room besides that on which Clennam sat, he sang, smiting himself on the breast as the gallant personage of the song. "Who passes by this road so late, compagnon de la Marlène, who passes by this road so late, always gay." "Sing the refrain, pig. You could sing it once in another jail. Sing it. Oh, by every saint who was stoned to death, I'll be affronted and compromising, and then some people who are not dead yet had better have been stoned along with them. Of all the king's knights 'tis the flower, compagnon de la Marlène, of all the king's knights 'tis the flower, always gay." Partly in his old habit of submission, partly because his not doing it might injure his benefactor, and partly because he would as soon do it as anything else, Cavaletto took up the refrain this time. Rigaud laughed, and fell to smoking with his eyes shut. Possibly another quarter of an hour elapsed before Mr. Panks's step was heard upon the stairs, but the interval seemed to Clennam insupportably long. His step was attended by another step, and when Cavaletto opened the door, he admitted Mr. Panks and Mr. Flintwich. The latter was no sooner visible than Rigaud rushed at him and embraced him boisterously. "How do you find yourself, sir?" said Mr. Flintwich, as soon as he could disengage himself, which he struggled to do with very little ceremony. "Thank you, no, I don't want any more." This was in reference to another menace of attention from his recovered friend. "Well, Arthur, you remember what I said to you about sleeping dogs and missing ones? It's come true, you see." He was as imperturbable as ever, to all appearance, and nodded his head in a moralizing way as he looked round the room. "And this is the Marshalsea prison for debt," said Mr. Flintwich. "Ah, you have brought your pigs to a very indifferent market, Arthur." If Arthur had patience, Rigaud had not. He took his little Flintwich with fierce playfulness by the 2 lapels of his coat and cried, "To the devil with the market, to the devil with the pigs, and to the devil with the pig driver. Now, give me the answer to my letter." "If you can make it convenient to let me go a moment, sir," returned Mr. Flintwich, "I'll first hand Mr. Arthur a little note that I have for him." He did so. It was in his mother's maimed writing on a slip of paper, and contained only these words: "I hope it is enough that you have ruined yourself. Rest contented without more ruin. Jeremiah Flintwich is my messenger and representative. Your affectionate M.C." Clennam read this twice in silence, and then tore it to pieces. Rigaud, in the meanwhile, stepped into a chair and sat himself on the back with his feet upon the seat. "Now, Beau Flintwich," he said, when he had closely watched the note to its destruction, "the answer to my letter. Mrs. Clennam did not write, Mr. Blondois, her hands being cramped, and she is thinking as well to send it verbally by me. Mr. Flintwich screwed this out of himself unwillingly and rustily. "She sends her compliments, and says she doesn't on the whole wish to term you unreasonable, and that she agrees, but without prejudicing the appointment that stands for this day week." Mr. Rigaud, after indulging in a fit of laughter, descended from his throne, saying, "Good, I go to seek an hotel." But there his eyes encountered Cavaletto, who was still at his post. "Come, pig," he added, "I have had you for a follower against my will now. I'll have you against yours. I tell you, my little reptiles, I am born to be served. I demand the service of this contrabandist as my domestic until this day week." In answer to Cavaletto's look of inquiry, Clennam made him a sign to go, but he added aloud, "Unless you are afraid of him." Cavaletto replied with a very emphatic finger negative, "No, master, I am not afraid of him, when I no more keep it sacramentally that he was once my comrade." Rigaud took no notice of either remark until he had lighted his cigarette and was quite ready for walking. "Afraid of him?" he said then, looking around upon them all. "Woof! My children, my babies, my little dolls, you are all afraid of him. You give him his bottle of wine here, you give him meat, drink, and lodging there. You dare not touch him with a finger or an epithet. No, it is his character to triumph. Woof! Of all the king's knights he's the flower, and he's always gay." With this adaptation of the refrain to himself, he stalked out of the room, closely followed by Cavaletto, whom perhaps he had pressed into his service because he tolerably well knew it would not be easy to get rid of him. Mr. Flintwich, after scraping his chin and looking about with caustic disparagement of the pig market, nodded to Arthur and followed. Mr. Panks, still penitent and depressed, followed too. After receiving with great attention a secret word or two of instructions from Arthur, and whispering back that he would see this affair out and stand by it to the end, the prisoner, with the feeling that he was more despised, more scorned and repudiated, more helpless, altogether more miserable and fallen than before, was left alone again. Chapter 29. A Plea in the Marshalsea. Haggard anxiety and remorse are bad companions to be barred up with. Brooding all day, and resting very little indeed at night, 'twill not arm a man against misery. Next morning, Clennam felt that his health was sinking, as his spirits had already sunk, and that the weight under which he bent was bearing him down. Night after night he had risen from his bed of wretchedness at 12 or 1 o'clock, and had sat at his window watching the sickly lamps in the yard, and looking upward for the first warm trace of day, hours before it was possible that the sky could show it to him. Now, when the night came, he could not even persuade himself to undress. For a burning restlessness set in, an agonized impatience of the prison, and a conviction that he was going to break his heart and die there, which caused him indescribable suffering. His dread and hatred of the place became so intense that he felt it a labour to draw his breath in it. The sensation of being stifled sometimes so overpowered him that he would stand at the window holding his throat and gasping. At the same time, a longing for other air and a yearning to be beyond the blind blank wall made him feel as if he must go mad with the ardour of the desire. Many other prisoners had had experience of this condition before him, and its violence and continuity had worn themselves out in their cases as they did in his. 2 nights and a day exhausted it. It came back by fits, but those grew fainter and returned at lengthening intervals. A desolate calm succeeded, and the middle of the week found him settled down in the despondency of low, slow fever. With Cavaletto and Panks away, he had no visitors to fear but Mr. and Mrs. Plornish. His anxiety in reference to that worthy pair was that they should not come near him, for in the morbid state of his nerves he sought to be left alone and spared the being seen so subdued and weak. He wrote a note to Mrs. Plornish, representing himself as occupied with his affairs, and bound by the necessity of devoting himself to them, to remain for a time even without the pleasant interruption of a sight of her kind face. As to young John, who looked in daily at a certain hour, when the turnkeys were relieved, to ask if he could do anything for him, he always made a pretence of being engaged in writing, and to answer cheerfully in the negative. The subject of their only long conversation had never been revived between them. Through all these changes of unhappiness, however, it had never lost its hold on Clennam's mind. The 6th day of the appointed week was a moist, hot, misty day. It seemed as though the prison's poverty and shabbiness and dirt were growing in the sultry atmosphere. With an aching head and a weary heart, Clennam had watched the miserable night out, listening to the fall of rain on the yard pavement, thinking of its softer fall upon the country earth. A blurred circle of yellow haze had risen up in the sky in lieu of sun, and he had watched the patch it put upon his wall like a bit of the prison's raggedness. He had heard the gates open, and the badly shod feet that waited outside shuffle in, and the sweeping and pumping and moving about begin which commenced the prison morning, so ill and faint that he was obliged to rest many times in the process of getting himself washed. He had at length crept to his chair by the open window. In it he sat dozing, while the old woman who arranged his room went through her morning's work. Light of head with want of sleep and want of food, his appetite and even his sense of taste having forsaken him, he had been 2 or 3 times conscious in the night of going astray. He had heard fragments of tunes and songs in the warm wind, which he knew had no existence. Now that he began to doze in exhaustion, he heard them again, and voices seemed to address him, and he answered and started. Dozing and dreaming without the power of reckoning time, so that a minute might have been an hour and an hour a minute, some abiding impression of a garden stole over him, a garden of flowers with a deep warm wind gently stirring their scents. It required such a painful effort to lift his head for the purpose of inquiring into this, or inquiring into anything, that the impression appeared to become quite an old and importunate one when he looked round. Beside the teacup on his table he saw then a blooming nosegay, a wonderful handful of the choicest and most lovely flowers. Nothing had ever appeared so beautiful in his sight. He took them up and inhaled their fragrance, and he lifted them to his hot head, and he put them down and opened his parched hands to them, as cold hands are opened to receive the cheering of a fire. It was not until he had delighted in them for some time that he wondered who had sent them, and opened his door to ask the woman who must have put them there how they had come into her hands. But she was gone, and seemed to have been long gone, for the tea she had left for him on the table was cold. He tried to drink some, but could not bear the odour of it, so he crept back to his chair by the open window, and put the flowers on the little round table of old. When the first faintness consequent on having moved about had left him, he subsided into his former state. One of the night tunes was playing in the wind, when the door of his room seemed to open to a light touch, and after a moment's pause, a quiet figure seemed to stand there, with a black mantle on it. It seemed to draw the mantle off and drop it on the ground, and then it seemed to be his little Dorrit in her old worn dress. It seemed to tremble, and to clasp its hands, and to smile, and to burst into tears. He roused himself and cried out, and then he saw, in the loving, pitying, sorrowing, dear face, as in a mirror, how changed he was, and how she came towards him, and with her hands laid on his breast to keep him in his chair, and with her knees upon the floor at his feet, and with her lips raised up to kiss him, and with her tears dropping on him as the rain from heaven had dropped upon the flowers, little Dorrit, a living presence, called him by his name. "Oh, my best friend, dear Mr. Clennam, don't let me see you weep, unless you weep with pleasure to see me. I hope you do. Your own poor child come back, so faithful, tender, and unspoilt by fortune. in the sound of her voice, in the light of her eyes, in the touch of her hands, so angelically comforting and true. As he embraced her, she said to him, "They never told me you were ill," and drawing an arm softly round his neck,